Thank you very much for coming. Today we're going to talk about Burgundy's viticultural revolution. And I think it's the first time that a tasting like this has been done, actually, because rather than looking at one particular appellation, one particular producer, one particular vintage, or even, the Côte de Beaune and the Côte de Nuits or whatever, instead we're going to range all the way from the Mâconnais in the south up to Chambolle-Musigny. We're going to look at wines that, in terms of market value, go from between over $1,000 a bottle with the Arnaud Lachaux and the crazy auction prices that I saw in New York a couple of weeks ago, to wines that you can still find in a good wine store for 35, 40 euros perhaps. So it's a novel theme, and what unites all of those wines, all the wines we're tasting today, is in fact not obviously an appellation. There are obviously some commonalities of grape variety and a broad regional union, but what we're looking at is their method of farming, and this is absolutely fundamental. And so I wanted to begin by showing you this picture. In Burgundy we hear an awful lot about terroir, and we hear a lot about appellations, and we all study what sort of limestone is where and how much clay there is in a given vineyard. But these three grape clusters come from exactly the same terroir, exactly the same lieu-dit. It's in Chassagne-Marchais, as it happens, and they are adjacent. The parcels touch. There is no geological difference. There's no difference in exposition. The sole differences you have are rootstocks and vine genetics on the one hand, and on the other, even more decisively, how they are farmed. And I want to try to talk you through why this is important. So you can see that this cluster here is about half the size of this cluster. The bunches are much more open. The cluster is smaller. The skins are thicker, and it's better aerated. So how does this translate to the wine? This is going to make a wine that's much more concentrated. We talk always about hectoliters per hectare or tons per acre. What you should really talk about in terms of yield is grams per cluster. So the smaller your cluster, the higher the ratio of solids to juice, the more concentrated and intensely flavored your wine will be. Also, the more structured your wine will be. So clearly there's a decisive difference between these two. Now the one in the middle, it's bigger, it's fatter, yes. You can also see it's considerably less ripe. These all picked at the same moment within minutes. And in 2020 vintage in Chassagne-Marchais. This one is from Olivier Lamy, by the way. You have one of his wines in the tasting today. And so this is going to produce a wine that's more herbaceous, that's maybe not necessarily more acid in terms of the numbers, but will be perceptibly more acidic tasting, tartar. And will not have the same sort of plenitude of fruit. This will make a rather softer, suppler, rounder, open, less concentrated, very giving wine. This something a little meager and herbaceous, and this something very concentrated, fully ripe, but very precise. And so, what is the difference if it is not the soil? Because that's all we hear about when we read about Burgundy. Well, in fact, it is the farming, surprisingly enough. And a cluster like this comes from vines that are managed and farmed a very different way. So to take the cluster in the middle is sort of the classic run-of-the-mill Burgundy producers farming of today. It's green like that because there are a lot of leaves. The vine is very vegetatively vigorous, and that means they'll be putting a lot of nitrogen fertilizers onto it. Sometimes using herbicides, which reduces the sort of competition for nitrogen, all of those things. And we can see, you can see how much greener it is than either of these clusters. Now this, obviously it's even more bloated, so there's plenty of fertilizer there, but it's been more de-leafed. The canopy was a little bit higher, and so the plant has been able to ripen the grapes somewhat more completely, even though it's still rather fat and juicy. And here, the vine has been trained completely differently. And I can show you some pictures, because it's hard to sometimes make sense of some of these things without seeing it. So this is a vineyard that's trained a bit like Olivier Lamy trains his vineyard. You see the vines have not even been cut at the top. They've been allowed to grow very high. Now, when a plant grows like that, it produces much smaller clusters. Because in fact, the sap of the plant is concentrated in a much larger plant. Every time you hedge, every time you trim this off, which is what the classic vineyards are trimmed about 1 meter 10 in Burgundy. Every time you trim it off, you encourage the plant to grow more leaves, and you reduce the actual size of the plant so that you force juice into the berries, essentially. You make the grapes swell. And you also encourage them to retain this sort of herbaceous flavor. You delay real ripening. So this big shift has really been going on in Burgundy since the late 90s, where people are starting, and it's inspired to some extent by looking at New World practices, in fact. to have higher canopies, which results in these smaller, riper, more concentrated clusters. And this vineyard actually belongs to Loire. It's the Pommard de Maine-d'Auvergne, but it's exactly the same practice. Now, why have people not been doing this? Why are vineyards hedged at 1 meter 10? Well, the answer is typical tractors for vineyard work in Burgundy. And the vines are planted at very high density, remember. So in Bordeaux, you can drive tractors between the rows because the density is low. It's easy. In Burgundy, the density is high, 10,000 vines per hectare. It used to be 20,000 before phylloxera. And to go between the rows is very tricky. The standard tractors have a capacity to go to about 1 meter 50. They go over the row, and you drive above the row. So, of course, you have to trim it. So you get in this cycle where you're trimming the vine to be able to go into the vineyard with the tractor, and you're using the tractor to trim the vine. And it becomes a sort of self-perpetuating vicious cycle of far too much intervention. This guy, Jean-Marc Vincent, wanted to be here today. We have one of his wines. He can't because he's fighting frost in his vineyards in Burgundy. And one of the solutions, you have technical solutions to go between the rows, so you can allow the canopies to grow high. You see, the canopy here is about 1 meter 80. And he's got this little caterpillar track device, which weighs less than a horse, that can go through the vineyard and cultivate. So there's been this whole explosion, really, around looking at canopy management to train the canopies higher, to result in these smaller, more concentrated clusters. And then all the attendant material challenges and solutions, equipment like this. What are some of the other things these producers are doing? Well, here, I think it's helpful to look back in time a little bit to some of the things that went wrong in Burgundy. And, we have to be candid that a lot of things went wrong in Burgundy in the late 1960s through to very recently. This was the era of intensive agrochemical usage everywhere in the world. And everyone thought it was progress. And, I have to say, I have a small vineyard parcel in Burgundy, and I've removed weeds from around the vines with a pickaxe. One time, my colleague Luis joined me, and he got blisters after doing about 5 vines, and he had to sit down. It's hell. I can absolutely understand why people adopted herbicides in the 60s and 70s when wine prices were very low, when the mechanical equipment for cultivating vineyards was actually much less effective than it is today. So you really had to do an awful lot by hand. It's brutal, but these guys are nuts. Jean-Marc Vincent, I think he told me he did the equivalent of, what was it? It was 7,000 kilometers a year on foot in his vineyards back in the late 90s when there was less equipment. I mean, it's outrageous over the course of the year. They're constantly in the vines. And a lot of these guys, Domaine Loire, you've all heard of it, we all know what the prices are. People like Jean-Marc Vincent did that for 20 years in obscurity with no one bothering to look and see what he was doing. So a lot of these sort of techniques are to do with undoing the problems caused by the use of herbicides, excessive fertilizers, sort of mechanization of the vineyard, which is really rather recent in its date. I mean, we went from horses to tractors only in the 1950s in Burgundy, so this is all new, and we're still coming to terms with what's the best way to manage the vineyard. There's also now particularly the incentive of a changing climate, especially drier, warmer soils. You can see that here, Jean-Marc and all the producers we're tasting here, and do start tasting, by the way. There's nothing worse than being talked at continuously without a drinker. But save it a little bit for the discussion. But by all means, get acquainted with the wines already. What they'll have been doing is trying to leave vegetative cover crop to protect the soils throughout the season. This has a number of advantages. You have more organic matter in the soil, which means it can absorb more water when it rains and retain more water. Obviously, better nutrition for the plants, but it also protects the soil from heat. So between a herbicide-treated bare soil and a soil with grass like that, there can be a 20 degrees centigrade difference in the soil temperature 20 centimeters down. So it's incredible. It's a really big difference. It's bigger than you'd think. And if you have a hot, dry vintage, it's amazingly advantageous in terms of the way the plant performs. The plant's much less likely to shut down. It keeps its leaves. Vintages like 2020. This is 2020. There are a lot of producers in the Côte d'Or where the basal leaves, these leaves along here that protect the fruiting zone from sunburn, that started to fall off and turn yellow August 10th, because I was there. And this was obviously not a problem for Jean-Marc with the way he manages his vineyards. I think that's, so a lot of people talk today about changing for grape varieties or how do we adapt to climate change. There's so much to be done. This is one of the things that really excites me. The other reason, to sort of conclude these introductory remarks before we start tasting, and please ask as many questions as you like, because it's a complicated topic. There are a lot of things we could go into if you like. But one of the reasons it's important to me is because, when I started reviewing Burgundy, it's a very complicated region, and we talked a lot about terroir, we talked a lot about tasting, but to me, clearly, there are two intermediaries between the wine and the glass and the soil, and they are agronomy and winemaking. So they're things that I absolutely wanted to interest myself in. I also found that, it's very easy to make mistakes when you're reviewing Burgundy. It's very tricky to review. The wines are not really built around tannin, in the way that Bordeaux is. Even a very young Bordeaux, you can get a sense of whether there's something in the glass or not, are the tannins ripe? And then, your range of error is less extensive, let's say. Now, wines that are built around acidity and have very delicate tannins, very delicate colors, some of these wines do, can be very hard, especially if they're reduced or they're shy when you taste them from barrel. And there can be wines that taste very flattering, that actually 5 years later you missed it because they were not actually genuinely good wines. They just tasted good on that day. So how to anchor wine criticism in something more material, you have to interest yourself in the process. So I started going to the vineyards and looking and seeing what people are doing. I know whose parcels are whose in a lot of the vineyards. And you make many fewer mistakes. I don't like to be wrong, and I find that it's remarkable. The people who are really attentive and put the hours in the vineyard and have intelligently managed vineyards, they tend to do the same thing in the winery, and then they tend to make very good wines, irrespective of whether they're in the Mâconnais or the Côte Chalonnaise or in a Grand Cru of the Côte de Nuits. So for me, it's been very instructive. I think I have maybe another picture. This is the guy who made the first wine that we're going to taste. He has a tendency to dress a little like a 1980s gym teacher. And he runs marathons. He's an incredible guy. I mean, super fit, much fitter than me, unfortunately. But he is in Mercury, right? So Mercury is one of those regions which, from the point of view of the wine trade, was supposed to occupy the price point between a Bourgogne Rouge and a village wine from the Côte de Nuits. So Mercury had to be a certain price. So what does that impose then? And wine journalists didn't bother to visit Mercury for the most part, and if they did, they'd do a centralized tasting with a trade group that would put together 100 wines without any context in an office, and you taste them, boom, done. So that imposes a dynamic of productivity on producers in Mercury. You have to make a certain volume because your wine cannot exceed a certain price. There's a glass ceiling. It can't get more than a certain score because it's Mercury. It can't get more than a certain price because it's Mercury. So you have to make more of it if you want to be rich and you want to have a nicer car, you want to have a swimming pool. And if you decide to do things that reduce your yield, you have to watch your neighbor getting a nicer car. You have to watch your neighbor getting the swimming pool or taking the vacation, and no one will buy your wine because it's too expensive. And this is the problem that Bruno encountered. And let's start tasting his wine. But he's a maniac, and he likes big challenges. He worked in South Africa. He makes his own barrels. He did some consulting, and then he came back to the family domain in the mid-90s. He made a fantastic 1994 Mercury. It was so good that a negociant from Beaune bought it and sold it to Chevrolet Chambertin. And this was, again, historically what happened when these wines were good, before the traceability that we have today in terms of paperwork. They were often sold as higher, grander appellations. Ravenau's Le Clos was always sold as Montrachet in Maxime's restaurant in Paris, for example, because Chablis. We don't know quite how good these wines can be. And what Bruno did, you can see perhaps a little bit, the density of planting is very high. So he planted vines instead of at 10,000 vines per hectare, he planted them at 20,000. So the competition between the plants is greater. You get even smaller clusters, even more concentrated flavors. You can taste it, to me. And then combined with all that concentration, intensity, and maturity, ripeness, because of the high canopies, because of the shading effect, you retain extremely fresh acidity. So the wine squares the circle, which is what all great white Burgundy should do, of having amplitude and tension. It's a false choice. Sometimes people say, well, I like freshness in wine. Or people say, well, I like texture. Well, I like freshness and texture. And that's what Chardonnay is all about. Chardonnay is about amplitude with incision, So I think it's It's a terrific wine, and Mercury is better known for its reds, but I wanted to show what he can do with white wine as well. To me, there's a real plenitude to this wine, but then it's so fresh, so tangy, and this is in a vintage 19, which is extremely sunny and warm. And I can tell you, if you go out and... the one mistake we made in this tasting is we needed a bad wine in both colors. From like a classic producer who phones it in and makes in 19 flabby, fat, slightly alcoholic, coarsely oaky Chardonnay, and someone who makes, you know, a really boring Pinot Noir. And they exist. There are plenty of them, you know. I try to avoid tasting them, frankly. But such wines exist. And next time I'm going to have to like put an anonymous bad wine in the tasting, just to compare, because you may not taste a huge amount of Mercury. You probably don't even have a huge context for how bad Mercury can be, and it can sit next to Premier Cru Saint-Aubin. So I talked a little bit. Did I talk a bit about Olivier Lamy? Yes, I think I mentioned him. He's in fact the guy who pioneered these high density plantings, and all the producers on this deck of wines are all friends, and they exchange. So it's almost like a team. And they exchange between them. High density plantings is something a lot of them have adopted. Saint-Aubin for me is like 20 years ahead of Mercury in terms of perception. Saint-Aubin 20 years ago was sold because on the map this is next to Puligny-Montrachet and Chassagne-Montrachet, and it's half the price. That was how it was sold. In fact, it's a completely different terroir. Saint-Aubin is situated in a combe, a valley. It's much more windy. It's not higher altitude for the most part than Puligny or Chassagne, but it's windier and much cooler. So it produces wines naturally that have a lot of tension, that they can be meager. And so the challenge is to build flesh into the wine and structure into the wine and density into the wine while retaining the acidity that comes naturally. Lamy is one of the pioneers of that, and he was the pioneer of very high density plantings, up to 30,000 vines per hectare. And it's almost a nightmare to prune them because you have to make sure that the shoots don't cross. Because if they cross, you get a concentration of leaves, humidity, and then disease. So he prunes these vineyards himself. They have to work them, cultivate them using a trolley plow. You can't get a tractor into the vineyard because it's too steep. And again, it's a project that you would never have thought to. No rational person would have ever undertaken it, knowing that the bottle price back when he started planting these high-density vineyards in Saint-Aubin was must have been like 15 euros for a Premier Cru, adapted for inflation, even. I mean, they were nothing, and that's to the price to the consumer, not when sold to the trade or in bulk. And in fact, his neighbors were very suspicious. Why are you planting more vines? They said, are you trying to make more wine? So they thought the yields would go up. And they even initiated a complaint to the appellation board, the INAO in France, about it. But then after 2 years, when they saw the yields went down, they withdrew the complaint. They just assumed he was an idiot. But now the wines explode in price, and I think everyone begins to see that this is kind of interesting. And so again, I talked a little bit about how people start saying, should we plant Sauvignon Blanc or Syrah in Burgundy? I mean, I sure hope they don't already have enough Sauvignon Blanc in Bordeaux now. Now that I'm reviewing white Bordeaux, but and they're also saying concomitantly, they're saying within these drier drought vintages, you need a lower density of planting. You need to legalize a lower minimum density of plantation, because otherwise the vineyards will suffer too much. Well, in fact, the vineyard at 30,000 hectares, 30,000 vines per hectare, does absolutely fine in a dry year, because it is farmed intelligently in terms of canopy management, soil health, for the last 20 years. Now, the people who suffer, the people who plant at very low density will be the same people who today can't, make it work at 10,000. They won't be able to make it work at 3,000. It's a paradox I see in Champagne as well. Everyone is saying global warming is going to be great for Champagne because people will be able to get more ripe grapes. But in fact, the people who couldn't get ripe grapes in the 1990s, today they don't have enough acidity in their grapes. Bad farming is always bad farming and always makes bad grapes and always makes inferior wines. That's just how it is. And the people who managed to ripen their grapes fully in the 90s in Champagne, well, they're the ones who are making fresh wines today. And it's absolutely the same in Burgundy. I mean, it's flagrant. So two quite different terroirs, all three of these. The third is maybe the oldest in the group. He's 66 now. Jean-Marie Vincent's Belgian, who studied theatre and then accidentally sort of became a winemaker after working a harvest in the Mâconnais. A great character. one of the geniuses of French winemaking. It's like, you could say France's best general, Napoleon, was an Italian, and maybe France's best white winemaker in the 20th century, along with Jean-François Coche, and Larry Bisleroy is a Belgian. So it's kind of one of the funny ironies that as an Englishman I like to tease the French about. But he was a real pioneer because he adopted some of these techniques of leaving grass growing in the vineyards, not hedging the vineyards, instead letting the shoots grow fully. And he's always been about trying to have he doesn't care really how many clusters he has, but he wants the clusters to be as small as possible. But all three wines for me, real intensity, incisiveness, and a lot of texture too. The Santenay is probably the most chiseled and chalky in general. And I think that also reflects the personalities of the winemakers. Olivier Lamy is actually a rather shy, thoughtful guy who takes time to sort of unwind, and his wines are like that. Santenay is also like that. But there's an element of people expressing their personalities. Guffens is the most extrovert of the characters, and it's the most extrovert of the three wines. And it's definitely, I would say, the most modest appellation is, of course, this Mâconnais. This is just a Mâconnais village level wine. Typically, this is vinified in huge tanks and sold in bulk for nothing. This is somebody taking a vineyard worth nothing on paper and given no credibility in making a wine. For me, that's fantastic. So, does anyone have any comments on or questions on the whites before we go into reds? Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that? And also some of those methodologies, would they help maybe to keep the alcohol tourism going?
Well, yeah, let's go back to the picture of the Leroy vineyard because it's instructive. So you might think that when you have a higher canopy, you're going to get higher alcohol in the wines because leaves photosynthesize, they produce sugar, which accumulates in the fruit. So the higher your canopy, the more alcohol you're going to get. But in fact, not so. Not entirely so. If you were to trim this canopy at this height, the vines would produce more lateral shoots, and you'd have a very dense wall of leaves here. That would indeed generate more sugar and make a higher alcohol wine. That's absolutely a big problem today in parts of Bordeaux, especially on the right bank, where people raise the canopies. It's looking at what people were doing in the New World, these higher canopies, but we're still hedging them, trimming them, and resulting in very thick canopies that generate a lot of sugar. So you have Merlot at 16, 17% alcohol, which is, for me, a bit fatiguing to drink and taste. But you see, in fact, this canopy is very sparse because the vines have produced no lateral shoots. So the canopy, while tall and thus creating a lot of shade, protecting the fruit from sunburn or dehydration or desiccation, is also not generating that much sugar. And this is the sort of glory of this method of viticulture, is it protects the fruit without particularly generating much sugar. Of course, I should say there are some disadvantages to doing this. A tall canopy like this, if you have mildew established up there, it's very difficult to treat with a tractor. You have to do it by hand with an atomizer. Normally people cut off the top and it cuts off all part of the canopy where the mildew is implanted. So you have to go through treating all the time in a difficult vintage. You can't get a tractor in there. You physically can't drive a tractor in. It really limits, and so it does have disadvantages. It requires a lot more work. So I can absolutely understand why people don't do it that way. But it's very interesting. And you imagine even if Leroy were to leave some grass and protect the soil a bit from sun, you could have maybe even better results. But these are all producers who manage. I mean, we have only warm, sunny vintages here, including 17, which was ultimately a rather sunny vintage. And I mean, none of the wines lack. For me, none of the wines lack freshness. They all have low pHs, high acids. But it's a big question, and people need to think about it. Fortunately, you won't find in 2021 many high alcohol wines. Yeah.
Just on the question of high alcohol
Yes.
and global warming, and given these guys are in a professional social network, as it were, how does the effect of a late prune, as I know, for example, Jean-Marc does, affect the timing of the budding and ultimately the effect of a hot summer on the grapes?
Yeah, I mean, its biggest impact is on obviously whether you frost or not, and then also on your yield. So the later you prune, the later the vine will begin its vegetative cycle, and thus if you have an early frost and you prune late, your vineyard is less likely to be budded out, less likely to lose your crop. Jean-Marc did quite a good yield in 2021. By contrast, late pruning also means the vine is somewhat stressed by this. And you get a lower yield than you would in a year where everything goes right. So Jean-Marc made much less wine than his neighbors in 2020 and 2018. He made much more wine than his neighbors in 16 and 21. So a lot of people would prefer to choose to make the appellation maximum 3 years out of 5 and then lose 2 crops pretty much. But that's a different mentality. Jean-Marc would prefer to have the same yield every year, and that's what he's aiming for. I think in terms of actual the ripening period, the vines tend to catch up. You know, he's not picking 2 weeks later than his neighbors. On the contrary, when you have a big canopy like that, you tend to get faster physiological maturity of tannins with somewhat lower sugars. This has not really been studied very much. Also, because you have to imagine that techniques like this are not of interest to the sort of bodies that fund research in wine. You know, the people who fund research in wine are big regional bodies where everyone subscribes, so they're just interested in the average, or they're big companies like Gallo or whatever, which is great, but they're interested in making more wine more efficiently. They're not interested in doing something that reduces the volume you produce. You know, so it's not really been studied, but what has been done is some empirical studies by various winemakers where they've taken the parcel, divided it in 2, and done it different ways. And now that's not something that would hold up in a peer-reviewed journal, of course, but it's very suggestive. And as are the results in the glass. It's suggestive enough for me to leave me entirely convinced, in fact.
You did mention a lot the viticultural practice of Leroy.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, not everybody, I think, can do Leroy style of practice. DRC, what's your assessment about DRC?
Well, DRC remains in a more traditional model of viticulture in terms of hedging the vines, in terms of working the soils very regularly. But this is also beginning to change. There's been changes of personnel at DRC. I think they're looking at what's going on. You know, I think when you have the pressure of being DRC, and when you have, Loa just does her own thing, and she answers to no one. You know. And she tried to do that at DRC, and it didn't work. DRC is not like that. Has a very different sort of relationship with the external world, and to change something radically at DRC is kind of a big deal. I mean, it's easier for someone in Santenay to do something original than it is for DRC, for example. But I think they're looking at things like this, you know, and they've remained attached to sort of what I would call the good tradition, which is when they hedge Romanée Conti, they do it with shears by hand. They don't drive a tractor in, compacting the soil and stressing the vine much more using a trimmer. They do it by hand with shears. You know, things like that. It remains the good side of classicism, and I think, in fact, the last few vintages of DRC, 2019 DRC wines are the best young wines I ever tasted from Domaine de Romanée Conti, I have to say. So, you know, what can you do? They have fantastic vine genetics, they have fantastic vineyards, and they exemplify the best of the old tradition, which is in the process of evolving, would be my answer. Yes?
Would you say that the best Santenay Premier Cru are nowadays on the same level like the Premier Cru of Burgundy?
I think it depends entirely on the producer. You know, people ask me questions about appellations and about vintages, and my favorite new response is to say, you know, generalizing about an appellation or about a vintage is like advising a man who's about to cross a river that it's 4 foot deep on average. Your mileage may vary, but I think clearly, you know, especially the haute densité of Lamy from Saint-Aubin, for me, is much better than the vast majority of Puligny Premier or Grand Cru today. I mean, there's no question. I try to review and score the wines as I would in a blind tasting. Now, I do have the occasion to taste blind, but most of my reviews, obviously, it's not possible to go to an estate and taste the wines blind. And you can't taste the wines if you don't go to the estate, unless you're tasting them from my own cellar, which I do on a regular basis. So I do taste a lot of Burgundy blind, but when I'm reviewing them, generally not. But I do try to score them without imposing this glass ceiling of saying, this is Saint-Aubin, so I subtract 2 points. This is Puligny, so it can't be that bad, you know. This is Chambertin, so it must, the lowest it can go is 92. I try not to be like that. I think that is something that perpetuates perpetuates established hierarchies. And I think the only real redeeming feature of the 100-point system in many ways is that it's a disruptor. It breaks glass ceilings. It puts things back into question. It encourages progress when it's correctly applied. The worst possible thing we can do when we score wine is to simply validate existing hierarchies and make wines that are already expensive more expensive. And now sometimes those top wines at the top of the tree are the best, and you have to say it as well. But I really try to use the scoring system to as much as possible, liberate producers. You know, Jean-Marc Vincent will get to his wine, it's wine number 5. But since he started being reviewed in the Wine Advocate, he was not reviewed in the Anglophone press before, by the way. Started making wine in 1998, so I started reviewing him in 2015. So he had to wait for a little while. But now he's been able to put up his prices by 30%. They're still very cheap. That means he can do an extra year of élevage. I mean, it's incredible. It's all being rolled back into the vineyards. He's replanting all of his vineyards at 20,000 vines per hectare. So I think that's the great side of the 100-point system. We often hear, you know, scoring is bad and so on. And, you know, sometimes it does inflame. It's like pouring gasoline on a fire. But something like what we can do there, I think, is actually meritorious and helps the region. At least that's what I like to believe. Okay. Shall we go on to the reds? Yes, very good. So here we have another vineyard that is managed with the sort of, they call it tressage, which means sort of braiding, if you like. Instead of trimming the canopies, you roll them over to sort of, you know, because you still want some sort of order so you can get in and out to do treatments. And this is David Coix. This is a guy who was not born into a winemaking family, but passionate about wine, and came to Burgundy, got a job working for a negociant house. Then managed to find an investor who was going to put up the money to buy an estate based in Beaune for him. And he's acquired vineyards, he farms it. My parcel in Beaune that I farm is opposite one of his, and I have to say, it is really beautifully done, his parcel, honestly. I mean, every time I walk past it, I think, why can't my vineyard look a bit more like that? But we're getting there, but it's beautifully done. And it's not, you know, Beaune, honestly, me and one other producer were the only people who bothered to put frost protection last year in our vineyards in Beaune, because it's just not taken seriously by people. No one who has Beaune doesn't have something better, almost. You know what I mean? In fact, Beaune in the 18th century was celebrated as producing some of the greatest wines in Burgundy. If you look at the Abbé Arnoux and things like that, the old books. But who needs to be told by somebody in the 18th century that the wine can be great? We can taste it in the glass. It's you know, you don't need to always look back to history, sort of validation of what's possible. You should just go and try. The reality is most Beaune is farmed badly. A lot of herbicides, just people phoning it in. And so when you take someone like David Coix, this is a very steep hillside vineyard, right at the top of the slope, in a combe, very stony soils here. Difficult to work by tractor, it's so steep. And then he does this tressage technique. They're very old vines. And you have a wine which has real aromatic range, plenitude, freshness. They can age very well. It's one of his most sort of minerally saline wines. Some of his 17s from lower lying sites are maybe a bit more flattering to taste today, actually. I find that the acidity is pronounced. It's got real cut. But in 10 years, that will serve it very well. You know, you'll have a wine that's extremely transparent, perfumed, precise. But I encourage anyone to look at his wines. He's probably the least famous of the producers on the table, but that's by design. I mean, I wanted it not just to be like an Arnaud Lachaud horizontal. I mean, we could do that one day, but it's nice to look at a set of wines where I don't think any single wine is out of place, but some are much better known and much more expensive than others. Then we go really down south, you know. Santenay was really famous in the 19th century, and they had a casino, so a lot of people came to Santenay. They had a railway station. These are sort of things that impact whether an appellation is prestigious or not. In fact, historical accident, nothing to do necessarily with wine quality, but everything started to go wrong, right? So after phylloxera, people had to make big choices about how they replanted and what they replanted with. You got corked? Oh no. We have a backup bottle. Louis, could you tell them there's a corked bottle of the Vincent, right? Yeah, mine's okay, but we have a backup bottle, so we'll. How many people have got a corked glass of the Vincent? Only 2? Normally there would be more than 2. Very slight. Well, we'll open it anyway, so we'll see. We can compare. But anyway, Santenay, and yeah, there was a big bottleneck in the vine genetics of Pinot Noir in Burgundy in the 1870s through 1920s, because all the vineyards had to be replanted. They all died, and they had to graft them over to American rootstock. So suddenly there was this big shortage of vine genetics. There's also obviously a period of great impoverishment in all French viticultural regions, because wine prices went up, but they didn't have any wine to sell because their vineyards were dead. So people, when they replanted, in many cases chose much more productive vine material for the grafts. And there's still a sort of bifurcation today in Burgundy between families that chose to preserve high-quality vine genetics, like the d'Angevilles, the Dugas, de Mendelramenet-Conti, and so on, and people who didn't. Now, the source of these very highly productive, fat-buried selections of Pinot Noir were various, but Santenay was a big center for it. So was Pernon in Pernon-Vergelès, and these sort of genetics, and also Mâconnais, and these very productive selections of Pinot Noir sort of spread all along the Côte d'Or, right? With the result that, especially villages where those selections came to be planted almost exclusively with very poor quality selections of Pinot Noir. Now, to mitigate that in Chassagne-Montrachet, you can prune grapevines essentially two ways in Burgundy. You can do cane pruning, make a cordon, or you can do spur pruning, which is the Guillot system, which is what most high quality producers do. Now you do cordon to limit the yields. So you have this paradox of people in Chassagne-Montrachet and Santenay for the red wines. They have these highly productive selections of Pinot Noir, but then to mitigate the productivity, they prune them in cordon. So you're really in a very paradoxical situation of planting something that produces too much and then trying to calm it down. In fact, you should be planting something that produces the right amount and trying to prune it so that the vine is healthy and balanced. That's really where you need to be. So this is a big thing holding back Santenay. And Jean-Marc Vincent decided to address that. So he planted Moselle selections taken from places like d'Angeville, better genetics, high density, and not in cordon. So I think you see some of the results. Gravier is the most celebrated historically vineyard in Santenay. Some of this is accident, right? Why is Gravier the most celebrated? There are probably other vineyards that are just as good or maybe better, but it's because it's the biggest. And so it was the most likely to have its name put on a bottle because it was better known. Same in Chambolle-Musigny. Historically, the two vineyards that people bothered to put the Premier Cru on the label were Les Charmes and Les Amoureuses. They're both the biggest, And there are a lot of fine vineyards in Chambolle and a lot of fine vineyards in Santenay that no one's really heard of, in fact. And they're always blended away. Yeah, there is a little. I think I've got we've got new bottle. Fantastic. You'll get the wine as it should be. But in the meantime, we can talk about the Boulay. So this is another, these guys, as I say, are more or less all friends. Some of them know each other better than others. But Boulay, to me, is one of the producers who best sort of exemplify what the Côte de Beaune can do. And you put his wines in blind tastings with the top producers of the Côte de Nuits, and any idea you have about Côte de Beaune, Côte de Nuits goes out of the window. And one for me as well. Yeah. So, this vineyard Les Frémiers. How many people have drunk Les Frémiers, Pommard, Les Frémiers, Premier Cru in this room before? Hands up. 2. There you go. 3. I should put my hand up, I suppose. But where does anyone? People know where it's situated? It is right below. This parcel touches the Rougien of de Monty. So this is right at the center. It's between Croix Noire, Chaponnier, and Rougien. It's at a crossroads. It's really one of the best possible spots in Pommard. Just because it's down on the slope doesn't mean that the soils are very rich. On the contrary, the rock, in fact, outcrops at the end of the vineyard. So it's more of a little sort of terrace, if you like. In fact, the top part of Rougien, where Boulay has its Rougien Haut, where the soils are thin, it's very steep, has much less in common with Rougien du Bas, the famous part of Rougien, than Frémier. Frémier, for me, is more in the style of Rougien than it is the style of, an inferior vineyard. Anyway, it's much better when it's not corked, huh? Yeah, it was slight, but it got worse as it sat in the glass as well. There you go. Then you have the wine as it should be. But Boulay, again, Fremier, this is another sort of example of it. Even within a famous appellation like Pommard, there are these glass ceilings, and if you go through, we'll speak close to home, go through the Wine Advocate database, look at all the historic tasting notes for Burgundy, of Pommard, Premier Cru, sorted by score, and you have 3 pages of Rougien and Epinot. And now Boulay, unquestionably for me, Fremier is almost always better than, almost always, not always, but almost always better than Rougien in Boulay's cellar. Certainly in terms of plenitude, body, muscularity, the Rougien he makes from the high part of the vineyard is actually extremely fine-boned, floral and elegant. But it's an example of how the appellation system, in fact the 100-point system and wine journalism, which should be challenging these preconceptions, has actually tended over time to reinforce them in Burgundy. It's probably the opposite of what happened in Bordeaux. In Bordeaux, scoring was really disruptive, and you give a bad score to Lafite and a good score to, Audemars Bouzet, like Bob did with the 82s back in the day, and it creates some disruption. In Burgundy, I think it tended to be the case more that, always have Musigny and Romanée Conti on top, and then everything was on a downward escalator from that point, right? And this is why Fremier is not a vineyard that people talk about, even though it's a fantastic vineyard. And this is why a lot of things are the way they are, in fact. And do you have any questions about the first 3 wines, rather than wait to go to the end? Any questions about the vinification? They're quite different, in fact, in some cases. The Fremier from Boulay has a lot of whole bunch, quite a lot of new oak, about 1/3 new oak. The Gravier is mostly destemmed. The Bresson is also mostly destemmed, I think. But you don't, those are sort of choices that actually impact it's the quality of the fruit that comes out, rather than the technique, I think. Even though these wines all these producers have their own individual styles, of course. Wine is a cultural artifact. You don't harvest bottles of wine, so that it's inevitably mediated by the producer. But equally, the style for me doesn't. That these are not technical wines in the sense you say this is a whole bunch wine. All right. But anyway, do feel free to raise your hands if you want to say something. But if not, we go to wine number 7. This is the media darling of contemporary Burgundy, Charles Lachaud, who's kind of done what people in Vosne Romanée really should be doing. If you're in Vosne Romanée, you have a license to print money. You can sell. It's like Chablis also. Chablis, you have a license to print 10 euro bills. In Vosne Romanée, you have a license to print, I don't know, hundreds at least. I mean, because it's just, you can sell it. You can sell. I mean, I have also I meet importers. Importers always say, "Oh, do you know anyone new in Vosne?" Because it's so easy to sell. And Vosne also, you can get away with anything. If you make a wine in Santenay that's too oaky, people say this is too oaky. And if it's too oaky and it's from Vosne, they say it's Vosne Romanée spice. It's fantastic. I can buy it at François Frère, But Charles Lachaud has not taken it as a right to print money, an entitlement to print money, but has rather taken owning some of the greatest vineyards in the Côte d'Or, the most historic, celebrated vineyards in the Côte d'Or, as an obligation to push things further. And maybe sometimes he's even gone too far. We're going to see in 2020 he made about 8 hectolitres per hectare. And now to give you some context, most producers would consider 30 to 35 hectolitres per hectare a low yield. A producer like Dujac is targeting 35. Most producers would like to make the appellation maximum, which is, it depends on the appellation what the maximum is. But in high-yielding vintages, they give themselves a surplus that they're allowed to add to it, and so on. It really becomes very significant, the yield. The optimal yield, I think, for great profound Pinot Noir is probably between 25 and 30, just in terms of that's what a balanced vine can produce without making too much fruit. But 8 is a sign that your vineyards are suffering. So Charles really suffered in the drought of 2020. He did very well, though, in 2021. So what he's done is total cover crop all the time. Grass grows in the vineyards. With very high density of planting like you have in Burgundy, and very old vines like he has. That's risky. The vines are really suffered. As I said, in 2020 they really suffered, but they seem to be coming back. But he's risking it. He's prepared to risk it. He knows that he can sell the wine because it's Vosne Romanée. In fact, the prices have exploded. I've seen this wine here is now trading for about 1,500 a bottle on the market. I mean, I've seen offers, and it's going. So the tickets were sold pretty cheap. So enjoy it. Actually cheaper than the Chateauneuf du Pape Masterclass, by the way. So he's risked everything. Like I said, higher canopies, total cover crop all the time. The vine genetics were always good, very good vine genetics in a lot of vineyards in Vosne-Romanée, it has to be said. And the winemaking, this is 100% whole bunch. Minimal percentages of new oak. And in 2018, rather short élevage. But I think he's making the most noise. He's actually the newcomer. He's the same age as me. We're both 1989 vintage. And he's made the most noise. I think it's great. It's giving a lot of attention to these techniques. And by association with him, some of the producers on this table, like Jean-Marc Vincent, are getting more of a spotlight on them, even though they're not from Vosne-Romanée. And I think he's contributing to generally, even though he comes from Vosne and makes these famous appellations like Romanée Saint-Vivant, he's contributing, in fact, to modern Burgundy, which, as I see it, is based, the prices of wines are increasingly based on the work and the quality, and less on just people who have fancy appellations and phone it in. I mean, I used to meet, it was a very British mentality. I met some people who in the UK who would always say, X producer is great because you can get a Grand Cru for a really good price. And I would always say, well, look, you get a Grand Cru that tastes, you pay the price of a Premier Cru for a Grand Cru that tastes like a Village. So did you get a good deal? I prefer to buy Village that tastes like Grand Cru, personally, but it's a question of what you want. A lot of people want to drink appellation, they want to. And there's a comfort in it, there's a narrative, having a Richebourg on the table. I would be the last person to want to pop that balloon. But equally, I think it's very invigorating and exciting that today's consumers are actually open to tasting wines like this. 10, 15, 20 years ago, you would have seen this lineup. And there's, for heaven's sake, there's one Grand Cru. But the Chambolle Village 30 years ago is not anything to get super excited about. Certainly no Chambolle Village 30 years ago for over 1,000 a bottle. And you would have seen Mercury and Mâconnais. I'll go to the Bordeaux class, And today that's not the case. So it's very exciting. And the new markets, new emerging markets, mainland China, are the biggest market for Jean-Marc Vincent. The new emerging markets are actually closer to the ground and faster to pick up on what is happening in Burgundy today than many of the established markets, which remain rather entrenched in this sort of concept of appellation, and the Grand Cru is always better. That being said, we are going to taste the Grand Cru in the end. So, Dugapi, I talked a bit about the this sort of bottleneck in Burgundy's vine genetic patrimony that occurred in the immediate aftermath of the phylloxera epidemic. The Dugas were very well positioned to deal with that because one of their ancestors, Jean Dugat, was a lady who was the best grafter of vines in Gevrey-Chambertin at one of the prominent nurseries. And she made sure that they had the best vine genetics that you could find in the Côte d'Or were kept for the Dugat family. So today, they actually even have a problem pruning their vineyards because people come into the vineyards to steal the cuttings before they want to prune them. So the vineyards get pruned practically by people stealing their cuttings before they can prune them themselves. Yeah, because people are aware that we're talking about tiny clusters with tiny berries, very concentrated naturally. And the farming has always been very good here. Very attentive. They were among the pioneers of doing these higher canopies, tressage. They don't speak any English. They don't travel much. So, they were not really. And they were also very I have to say, they were popular with my predecessors. They were popular with Bob, and they were popular with Pierre Ivani. There was no bigger kiss of death amongst Burgundy collectors than to have got good notes from Parker in the 1990s. And there are even whole vintages, like 1997 Chablis is a fantastic vintage for Chablis, but Pierre Ivani liked it. So all Burgundy collectors globally assumed that it must be bad. So hopefully we can move beyond some of these things. And it has to be said, the Dugas family pushed, they took great fruit and they pushed it very hard. So they made some very extracted tannic wines. Again, if you're called Dugas, you don't necessarily get such good oak barrels as if you're called Rousseau, because there's this sort of, these hierarchies permeate Burgundy at every level. And they used to get oak barrels that sometimes made the wines a little coconutty, rather vanilla-y. And people, I think Burgundy purists found them a bit much. Now, in fact, everything has now changed. The farming remains great. The viticulture is some of the best in the Côte. I mean, everyone will tell you if you I know you walk the vineyards, you can see it. But they just decided to push that grapefruit less hard and let what comes naturally come naturally, and on the principle that The good stuff extracts itself pretty much. And with their kind of fruit that they have, you just don't need to do a lot of aggressive extraction to make a concentrated, intense wine. You have to have confidence in your fruit. You're seeing this today in contemporary Bordeaux as well. Look at a producer like Trolon-Mondot in Saint-Emilion. They used to push to make these sort of monstrous wines. In a site that naturally has 8 meters of clay, it makes very powerful wines. Now today they decided to stop pushing. I mean, the analogy I use is if you're driving downhill, you don't need to floor the accelerator. Huh? You can ease off. And you'll get to your destination in a better condition generally. And this is exactly what happened for the Dugas. And 17, to me this is a little closed aromatically compared to how it was. I haven't tasted it for about a year, and it was a real... Well, for the pH is probably 3.3, so I think it's pretty fresh. But for me, it's a little shut aromatically. This was extremely floral, peony violet a year ago. It begins to shut down. That's one of the challenges with rather concentrated, serious wines. You have to maybe even extend your élevage. You have to let the wine spend longer in barrel. You should maybe start releasing the wines with 5-6 years on the clock. This is something Le Chaux is thinking about doing, but it's very difficult to establish that sort of rotation of stock. There's the sort of cash flow issues of taking a domain that bottles everything at 18 months and sells it immediately to bottling everything at 24 months and selling it at 5 years after that. I mean, that's very challenging. And to explain that to a bank manager who might not know anything about wine, well, good luck, you know. So it is a challenge. Some of these guys are doing it. That's why I have immense respect for some of my favorite producers in Champagne, who started with a stock of 0 reserve wines. Someone like Aigle-Urier now has the equivalent of 17 years production, which in stock in terms of reserve wines aging before disgorgement. Imagine not taking a paycheck for 17 years of your career. I mean, incredible. That's what he did. So I have immense respect for that. I think there's room to do more of that in Burgundy, and especially very serious wines. Even in 17, an open, rather light vintage, which we picked deliberately for that reason. To me, that's a little closed. So I agree. But for me, it's fresh. I mean, I think the lab analysis would back that up. Not that analysis is everything, but. Any other questions?
What do you think Burgundy is going in terms of price?
Yeah, I mean, clearly there's a crazy cultural moment happening. I think it's going to be difficult for the bubble to burst, maybe. I mean, all bubbles burst, perhaps, but is it a bubble, is the question. Firstly, there's very little wine. Look to what happened to Bordeaux 2010, when you're looking at Chateau Lafite, for example, which is a wine people lost money on Primeur for 10 years, and now just about break even. When you don't even factor in storage. That's an estate of 110 hectares. So the entire production of Chateau Lafite is the same as the entire surface area of Volnay Premier Cru, right? So there's a lot more wine in Bordeaux. The Bordeaux bubble sort of burst in 2010. Can the Burgundy bubble burst when we're looking at, for Frémier, we're looking at 8 barrels. For La Chaux, Chambolle, we're looking at 15 to 20 barrels. For this wine, we're looking at 6 barrels, the Charme of Dugapi. For Domaine de Croix, maybe 8 barrels. The others I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, but I taste these. But these are micro production wines, so you don't need many rich people to want them for the price to really go up. And I think you're seeing a lot of things going on. You're seeing generally people are happy to put a lot of money into consumer goods. Some very rich people. You're also seeing a whole new cadre of consumers who don't have a sense of price that's tethered to the last 10 years. If you're buying wine in mainland China, you already have to pay 100% tax on it. So they really don't care what the price is. They just want the wine, And yeah, it's hard to know. I mean, it's hard to look at it and not think there's a bubble at work. But equally, the prices are not going down, And every time I look, they seem to have gone up appreciably. I mean, look at Rousseau-Chambertin, I think went up about 3K this year. When I thought that's a wine that's stabilized because there's a certain production. Maybe people are more excited about things like Arnaud Lachaux, Leroy, and whatever. But no, Rousseau-Chambertin is now trading for $8,000 a bottle for the 2019 in some places, dollars, US. So yeah, essentially, I don't know. I don't see any real reason why it should crash, and unless there's some sort of world political event that will have us worrying about many other things beyond whether our Burgundy portfolio is depreciating. That being said, there remain, these wines like Laurençon has got more expensive in the last 5 years. Yes, so has Vincent, so has Guffins and whatnot. But these wines still remain really rather affordable. And I think that is sort of the future of affordable Burgundy. If we can apply the methods that historically were only ever used on Grand Cru throughout the whole of Burgundy, suddenly the whole of Burgundy is producing a lot of very interesting wine. And we don't just need to chase the 1.3%, which is what the Grand Cru represent in terms of surface area. So, other questions? Do we have any favorites? Should we do just for curiosity? But for the whites, perhaps between. Do people want to raise their hand for wine number 1? Yeah, couple, not too many. I think you're a bit harsh on wine number 1. Wine number 2. Yeah, and wine number 3. Interesting. So pretty split. That. And for the reds, we can do the same thing. Favorite for number 4? No favorites for number 4. Fair enough. Number 5. Yeah. 6. And 7. You've got expensive taste, folks. Sorry. 8. The Anu La Chaux. Yeah, that's about 1,500 a bottle at the moment on the market. But even it's crazy. I mean,
I thought you speak about the Ducapi.
Oh no, the Ducapi is more like 500 to 600. So I think it's still paid for the ticket, right? Okay, well, if I'll stay around at the front, and if anyone wants to wander up, or I'll circulate a bit. You want to ask any questions? Absolutely feel free, but if not, thank you very much for coming. I hope it's been something a bit different, and it's been great fun to present it. So thanks a lot. Cheers.